Hello, my name is Eric Patterson, and I serve as Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And this is an interview with Father Deacon Andrew Bennett about the crisis of scapegoating the faithful under COVID-19. Let me tell you a little bit about Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. He's director of the Cardis Religious Freedom Institute in Canada. He's an ordained deacon in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the Eparchy of Toronto in Eastern Canada. He's also senior fellow and director of the North American Action Team with us at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. He served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom and head of the Office of Religious Freedom from 2013 to 2016, during which time he led in defending and championing religious freedom internationally as a core element of Canada's foreign policy. He's a gifted speaker, author, and thought leader. Please help me welcome Father Deacon Andrew Bennett.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's good to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, let's get right to, this has been a tough year. It's now November 2020, and the crisis of COVID-19 has been going on for the better part of this calendar year. So tell us a bit, is there a problem in Canada of scapegoating the faithful, and what form does that take?
I'm not sure if I would use the term scapegoating. I think my sense is that there's not a lot of deliberate targeting of churches and other faith communities in the country. But what concerns me is really something that you and I have talked about before, and that is this amnesia that exists where civil authorities don't fully understand how religious communities operate. And the role that faith communities play within our society. And there's been a call by a lot of faith leaders that they be considered an essential service. So if we look at essential and non-essential services, they want to be considered in that essential category. And I understand why they do that, because they're looking at the regulatory framework that basically enables civic public health authorities to restrict the activities of faith communities, especially in terms of public worship. And those communities want to sort of situate themselves on the right side of the line. But I think that is in fact a diminishment of faith communities within our society, within our common life. Faith communities are not just simply services. They're not just an essential service. They're deeply integral to the lives of human beings, in our communities. And a significant proportion of people in the United States and in Canada are deeply religious and are engaging in religious services on a regular basis. And they need to have that in their lives where they can participate fully. Now, at the sake of trying to diminish the role of faith communities in our society down to just meeting the needs of their own members, I think we also have to look at what role do these faith communities play in the broader society. And my concern is that quite often public health authorities, other levels of government, do not fully appreciate in moments like this, moments of crisis, that faith communities not only provide an anchor for their own congregants, their own faithful, but actually are the ones that are going to help people who are suffering at a time of pandemic, whether it's from the effects of the virus itself, or whether it's fear, anxiety, depression, marital struggles. It's those communities that are going to be there to support those people who may be part of their faith community or maybe outside of their faith community. So again, I don't fear so much the scapegoating, but I do worry about the amnesia and the lack of insight that often our civic officials have for the role of faith communities.
This is a very helpful distinction. We've seen in other parts of the world where religious or ethnic minorities have been targeted as unclean, as the purveyors of sickness, and in this specific case. And so that's set them up for repression. But in the West, our governments have patted themselves on the back a little bit. Well, we don't do that. But you're reminding us that there's a whole set of restrictions that have actually targeted churches and other houses of worship in a unique way. Could you tell us a little bit more what you've seen in terms of these restrictions on faith communities?
Well, the restrictions vary tremendously, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons. I think, again, we have to look at what is the prudential response. So using the best evidence available to us as to how the virus is spreading within different communities or different parts of communities geographically, whether we're talking about the United States or Canada, it's pretty similar. We have to distinguish between prudence and a response that does not reflect prudence, but a little bit of fear and a very heightened level of risk aversion. And so that's one thing we have to address first, is what is motivating the actual restrictions? Is it good evidence-based actions that are informing how civic officials, actually decide to act? Are they consulting a wide range of expertise, not simply epidemiologists and virologists, but also consulting mental health practitioners, consulting people that have an understanding of how the economy functions at times like these? Are they getting a broad and robust set of policy arguments advanced so that they can make the best judgments possible? So that's the first question around restrictions. The second one is a question of equity. When restrictions are imposed in an effort to address the public health crisis, are they being imposed fairly? So we've seen in a number of jurisdictions, both in the United States and Canada, where public health authorities have stepped in and have basically enforced a ban on public worship. Now, we can sort of slice and dice how that actually comes about. Do the public officials actually impose the ban, or do they ask the religious leaders, whether we're speaking about bishops or groups of pastors, to actually enforce what they would like to have happen, and that is the restrictions on public worship? So we see that this is taking place in various jurisdictions where the restrictions on public worship are not the same type of restrictions that are being imposed, for example, on other forms of gathering. Whether we're talking about people going out for dinner in restaurants, whether we're talking about people engaging in lawful protest, whether we're talking about people that are going to gyms or whatever it might be, there's often a lack of equity. So let me use two concrete examples from the Canadian case. So in the first wave of the pandemic, so if we go back to the beginning of March, the Archbishop of Toronto, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Toronto, Thomas Cardinal Collins, took a lead in acting and saying, we will be good citizens as the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, and we see where things are going with this virus. We will voluntarily close our churches, and so there'll be no public masses anymore, only private masses that will be televised for the faithful and so forth. That was a prudential decision on the part of the Archdiocese of Toronto, demonstrating that they recognize that the civil authorities have jurisdiction when it comes to public health. Now, we learned a lot about this virus and how it spreads and so forth. And if we look at faith communities as we came out of that initial lockdown and we had a resumption of public worship with various restrictions that I think most people can determine were fairly reasonable, religious communities stepped forward and said, yes, we recognize the jurisdiction of civil authorities, and we will abide by these prudential restrictions so that we can open up our churches, our synagogues, our mosques again. Now what we're seeing going as we've gone into the second wave is that there's a real patchwork about how civic authorities are responding to the second wave. In some cases, it seems like they haven't learned their lesson from the first lockdown. And so you have often a lack of, as I say, equity in restrictions. So let's take now, again, the province of Ontario. The province of Ontario in certain areas has gone into a lockdown again, notably in the city of Toronto and in Peel region, which is an adjacent urban area to the city of Toronto. So it was announced that all religious services, public services, would be restricted only to gatherings of 10 people. And so that basically meant an end to regular Sunday worship in the case of churches, regular Saturday Shabbat services for synagogues, so on and so forth. And so basically they're allowing small gatherings for weddings, funerals, this type of thing. But the province also recognized that, to be fair, a similar restriction had to apply for other forms of indoor gatherings. And so the restriction is on for 10 people, no more than 10 people for indoor gatherings, public, private, so forth, in these areas where there is now a lockdown. If we go to the province of British Columbia, the same level of fairness is not in play, because places of worship have been told they can no longer have public worship. But restaurants, gyms, other areas of public gathering have relatively limited restrictions being imposed on them. And so one begins to question, and I think anyone that has eyes to see can say, this doesn't seem very fair to me. Why is this jurisdiction of British Columbia, why have they chosen to impose an overly burdensome restriction on public worship, yet not on these other forms of public gathering? So this is something that is a major issue, especially when you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There seems to be a lack of sort of equity in how restrictions are being applied. And it seems, well, where's the evidence that demonstrates that public worship are these so-called super spreader events? So I think we need to, hold our public officials to greater account, demonstrate the rationale behind your actions. What's the scientific evidence for this? And then secondly, let's have some parity. Let's have some, make sure that this is being done fairly and that you're not targeting religious communities unfairly. And I think when it does happen, it shows a real lack of understanding of the role of faith communities, again, in the broader society.
Now, you've used the term amnesia, both in your writing and earlier today. And would you say a bit more about this? I mean, what do you mean by government officials are suffering from amnesia? And do you feel also that citizens are suffering from this amnesia?
Yeah, and this is a really crucial point, I think, for Western democracies. As you're rightly pointing out, whether it's during this pandemic or at other times, comparatively speaking, religious freedom in the United States, Canada, the UK, various places is fairly robust. Are there challenges? Yes, there's always challenges. But we're not talking about a situation like China or Pakistan or countries where there's very serious restrictions placed by government. And there's also a high level of social hostility in some of these countries where people are paying with their lives, they're being tortured, they're being imprisoned because of what they profess. Thanks be to God, that is not happening in our Western democracies. The challenge that we have, especially in the United States and Canada, is this amnesia. And the amnesia has two aspects to it. The first one, as you rightly highlighted, is with regards to our public institutions. In the United States and Canada, religious freedom, in Canada also freedom of conscience, is the first freedom that is enumerated in our corresponding Bills of Rights, or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. And so that gives it, as we always talk about at RFI, that gives it a certain preeminence, that it seems to be a particularly important freedom because other freedoms kind of plug into it. And so we always talk about it as being America's first freedom. So that means, that first freedom means that there is a responsibility on the part of both citizens and government to respect the inherent freedom that we have as citizens to live out our most deeply held religious beliefs, whether that's in worship, whether it's in the actions that our belief motivates us to, how we engage in community, and so forth. When our public institutions begin to forget that religious freedom is a first freedom, as we've seen both in the United States and Canada, and I don't always think it's based on some malicious intent. I think in many cases, it's as a result of a lack of formation, a lack of education about why religious freedom is so important. And so we see in both Canada and the United States, whether we're speaking about the public service, the media, the judiciary, the corporate world, we have sort of kind of accepted this argument that, well, religion's a private matter. It's a bit of a messy thing. And sort of go back to our risk aversion argument. It's a bit of a messy thing, so let's just not deal with it. And so you people of faith, you do what you want to do in those buildings over there on Friday or Saturday or Sunday. Do what you want behind those four walls. But when you come into the public square, well, we're a little bit uneasy about how you express yourself religiously. And we can point to how this amnesia developed. I think a lot of it has to do with, there's a tendency within liberal democracies for a great kind of leveling out. Let's level everything out so there's equality, and so that we deal with messy differences. Let's just level everything out. So that's a challenge where we have this amnesia in our public institutions that no, in fact, religious freedom is about everyone being able to live out their most deeply held beliefs in their private lives and in their public lives. And when you remove those expressions of belief, whether we're talking about theistic or atheistic belief, from the public debate, that debate becomes impoverished. And you don't have as robust a pluralism within civil society that you need to have for democracy to really flourish. So that's the first side of the amnesia. The second side is within faith communities themselves, there is an amnesia. And, as the fellow with the Roman collar, I have to say that Christians are the worst offenders in this regard. Over many decades, a lot of us as Christians have been formed with this idea that you don't talk about your faith publicly. It's what you keep in the comfortable pew, maybe what you talk about at home, but I'm certainly not supposed to take it into my workplace, into my university, into my school, into my social circles, because I don't want to offend anyone, or maybe people will be offended by my beliefs, and that's going to cost me socially, or it's going to cost me politically, or it's going to cost me economically. And so I'm just going to privatize my faith. I'm going to privatize my faith and just kind of, be safe. Well, that's also an amnesia, because when we privatize our faith, much in the same way that civic institutions will marginalize faith in the public square, we are again excluding that important voice that we bring from our particular religious tradition or philosophical tradition that has deep roots and has something to say about our common life, has something to say about how we live together as citizens. And so that amnesia is also damaging because it impoverishes our public debate and it impoverishes our public lives. And it's also just not authentic. I can't have a private religious faith, and then when I leave my house in the morning, I put my religious faith in a little box, and off I go out into the public square, and I engage as if I don't have beliefs that inform my public action. And then back out and I put it in my pocket, and now I'm somehow a whole person again. This is a very flawed understanding of how belief, whether we're speaking about religious belief or non-religious beliefs, shape us as human beings. And so if we want to have, as I said, that robust pluralism and genuine public debate, we need to have a wide open public square where people can gather and engage in thoughtful dialogue, thoughtful debate, where they bring their whole selves into that. And I think both of our countries, the United States and Canada, are suffering terribly in this regard, where public debate really has become a bit of a gated community. And you have to sort of adhere to certain accepted strands of debate, strands of discourse. Otherwise, you're sort of beyond the pale.
So Andrew, what's to be done? How do we change? How do we recover the vitality of religion, religious freedom in our societies today?
I think, again, there are two aspects. One is education and formation, and the other is sort of a bold public witness. but one depends on the other. So first of all, I think as we've been working at the RFI for a number of years now around the educative side of religious freedom, we have America's first freedom curriculum that helps to shape young people around why is religious freedom so fundamental? What is the anthropological reason for it? How are we as human persons oriented in a particular way towards seeking truth, to seeking what is beyond us, to needing, as our good friend Rabbi David Novak says from the University of Toronto, human beings have this great metaphysical need. And so we have to re-engage people with that metaphysical need that they have. And to do that requires education, requires formation, so that you can explore with young people, but not just young people. We need to do this also with our leaders. We need to do this with people in various walks of life to say, what does it mean for you to exercise your free exercise? Free exercise is not simply some words in the First Amendment. These are words that have to be lived. They're not simply a right, there's an attendant responsibility with them. So if I have free exercise, well, just the very phrase seems to imply some sort of action involved. You can't exercise physically by sitting in a chair. You have to get up and exercise. And the same thing with our civic duties. We have to exercise our freedoms because otherwise they will shrivel. One friend of mine described religious freedom as like a delicate orchid. Orchids are pretty robust, but if you don't continue to nurture them and tend for them, they will eventually wither. And so we have to recognize that our freedoms come with these attendant responsibilities, and especially religious freedom. So we need to educate people about what is religious freedom. How do you live out your religious freedom? How do you live out your religious freedom in your various public engagements in your public life? How do you do that? And once you do that, well, then you can move to the next stage, which is a bold engaging of the public square with your beliefs. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to battle the amnesia. We have to really challenge it and do it in a way that is winsome, in a way that is charitable, and in a way that invites dialogue. We tend to often adopt a very litigious approach to how we deal with religious freedom and religious freedom violations. And I think the work that we do at RFI is very important because we want to deal with things way before they get into the courts. Let's look at, again, this anthropological question. Who are we as human beings? Who are we as, body, mind, and soul? And let's engage in that type of reflection and develop an educational approach that helps people engage with that so that they can recognize that to be a faithful and engaged citizen means to be fully yourself in the public square. And hopefully that will lead to a greater boldness. Now, there are many other resources that we can use. There are many other things that we can engage. RFI engages with the media on a regular basis. We're engaging with faith leaders. We're engaging with political leaders to try and move the meter stick. I'll use a Canadian term. Move the meter stick a little bit so that we can advance this battle against this amnesia and recover what I think people know. But it can be a bit frightening at times for some people because they believe that, well, if I live out my most deeply held faith, it's going to cost me. Well, there are very few things in life that don't have some sort of cost if you desire to be truthful and authentic. So that would be my response, is that we have to have robust education and formation, not simply for young people, but also for our leaders, so that they can participate fully in public debate, bringing their whole selves, including their most deeply held beliefs.
Well, let's end with the good news. What's the good news? Are there points of light? Are there faith communities that have taken the opportunity of this pandemic to serve in new ways or to be a witness that's come to your attention? What are some of the bright lights that you've been seeing during COVID-19?
That's a very good question. Um, I'm a real believer in sort of entrepreneurial religion, to put it kind of pithily. Um, I think that faith communities have a duty to remain faithful to their tradition and to live their tradition in a way that is without equivocation, to really be authentic and to show that to the world. But you got to do it smartly, and you have to do it in a way that invites engagement, in a way that brings people into contact with you. And so I would hope that with the pandemic, a lot of faith communities have not sort of thrown up the walls, but have in fact opened the doors of the church or the gurdwara or the mosque or the synagogue, even with restrictions, but maybe they're doing it, via social media, maybe they're doing it via various other virtual means. Although not ideal, because it takes away that important sort of human dimension. For the time being, I think those communities that recognize that they continue to play a role, they will find ways to do that. And, I've been impressed by the various ways people have made use of technologies like Zoom, Facebook Messenger. I've got a good friend who's an Orthodox rabbi here in town in Ottawa. And like every, faith leader, he struggles with getting his faithful, to the shul for Shabbat services. And he always had, different types of formation, different types of classes he would offer in Talmud, in looking at the Torah portion for the week. But then when the pandemic hit, he had to put these classes online. Now he has hundreds of people coming on to take his classes in Talmud, in various aspects of Torah. And these are people that were previously not engaging with the synagogue. And so he sees it as a way to, once the restrictions are lifted, to bring more people back to their Jewish faith, because all of a sudden they've been given this opportunity to do so in their home, to inquire more deeply into their Jewish faith, and they're seeking this out at this time of pandemic. So he's really excited about it. In my case, ever since the pandemic, I've been offering weekly reflections with our young adults through my parish here in Ottawa. And right now, one of the things we're doing is, the group is called Saints, because as Christians, we're called to be saints. And so between now and Easter, every Saturday we have a reflection on a saint for our times. And that is to get these young adults to look to, who are these men and women through the history of the church that have stepped forward and served in some way. Maybe they've stepped forward and stood up for religious freedom. Maybe they've stepped forward and exercised a really radical form of charity. These are the sort of men and women that we should see as our friends and as our great models. I know other churches that are doing similar things. We're trying to give people the language and the spiritual support to get through a time like this. The Thomistic Institute in Washington, D.C., the Dominicans there have been running all of these amazing online lectures about different aspects of plague and how do you deal with times like this. And they did a whole series very early on in the pandemic around the nature of plague, the nature of pandemic. What do we learn from this? So in a way, although it's not an ideal situation because it's sort of a depersonalized, sort of virtual gathering, we have been given these new technologies that for this time allow us to reach out to people. And I think those faith communities that are entrepreneurial are the ones that are really engaging with this technology, recognizing that it's not the ideal, but a means to continue to engage people. And I'm sure there's probably hundreds more examples, both in the US and Canada. But I know that a lot of communities I know, they're concerned about when the pandemic ends and people, the restrictions are lifted on public worship, will people come back? And this is, I think it will be a challenge. And again, I think those communities, those faith communities that really open their doors again and go out into the public square and speak about what they believe and speak about what they do through the various outreach that they have, those will be the communities that will continue to grow and thrive. So
I think that's very helpful. It's been amazing to me how what has been unsung during this crisis by the media are all the faith communities who day to day help. They give, they serve the poor, they work in orphanages, foster care, money goes abroad to help the starving. And all of that seems lost. We've rightly lauded medical staff, policemen, firemen, people who've been on the front lines, EMTs. But there's been so little news that I've seen that has pointed to the faithful work of people on Skid Row, people serving the marginalized and the needy. And they're doing it they're doing it not as their primary way to make a living. They're doing it because their love of their fellow man, as a reflection of their love of God, compels them in compassionate charity to do these things. But the good news is it continues. And I think that you're exactly right. This is a time where the evidence of religious faith is in the practice, in the way that people continue to practice, whether it's in online ways or if it's in person-to-person ways. So it really is a time where there's a challenge before people of faith.
And I think just to that point, I think that's a very important point that you raise, that at the local level in our communities, people know what faith communities do. So in every town, city in the United States and Canada, families know, oh, if I want to put, John into Boy Scouts, we go down to Christ Church Episcopal down the street. If I need to take advantage of a 12-step program, I can go to Sacred Heart. They have this 12-step program every Wednesday night. Or if I need a meal, I can go down to the mosque and they have an In From the Cold program. People know that this is what faith communities do. The challenge is when we get up to the level of officials and leaders that there seems to be, again, a bit of a forgetfulness that this is the active presence of people of faith in the community. And again, these people do these things not because the state tells them to, not because they're getting money necessarily to do this. They do it because their faith calls them to do it. And it's not just for their own faith community, but it's for the life of the world. And I wrote an article about a year ago for one of our Cardis publications, Convivium magazine, which I entitled, "Will the State Hug Me When I Die?" And of course the answer is no, the state will not be there to hug you when you die. But human beings will be there. And those human beings might be members of a particular faith community who are there helping you at that time of death, at the time of suffering. And so it's incumbent upon us, when we talk about religious freedom, to really call out those who see religious freedom as merely the freedom to worship. That is a real diminution of religious freedom. Worship is just the beginning. What is the liturgy that is lived out after the liturgy? What does the worship impel me to do as a person of faith? Well, it calls me to go into the streets. It calls me to go into the homes of people. It calls me to go into the hospitals, into the prisons, to do this work, not just for me, not just for my faith community, but for the human beings that I come into contact with on a daily basis, in whom I see this radical equality. We have a radical equality as human beings. And that is something that our faith traditions can really help us to remember. And so I think it's crucial what you said, that we have to, at times like this, recognize that, yes, this work continues to go on, and these communities continue to do this unsung work. And people know that. We just have to remind the people in charge that they know that.
Amen. Well, this has been a very interesting time, and there's some things that I've learned as well about how to think about these things, and this reminder about how just important, not just religious freedom is, but the religious faith that animates so many of our fellow citizens in Canada and the United States. So Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, thank you so much for this time and for this interview.
Thank you, Eric. It was my pleasure.